Julie Spencer was found on a cold June morning in Fairbanks in 1996. At first, the town accepted the shortest, saddest answer. A teenage life ended. A community mourning. A case closed. But 3 days after she was found, a text arrived on her best friend's phone. It read stark and impossible. He's not done. That single message refused to be soothed by official paperwork. It kept turning over in the minds of people who loved Julie, in late-night whispers in classroom corners and the grocery store lines, until 6 years later, an old cell phone, a forgotten pager, and a single overlooked footprint opened the lid on a secret that had been simmering in the town all along. The discovery would end with handcuffs in a courthouse hallway, a jury's slow deliberation, and confessions that smelled of relief and betrayal. This is the story of the Alaska 1996 cold case solved, how rumors hardened into evidence, how a community silence gave way to a courtroom's echo, and how one member of a secret group chat never left town. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe to Calis-Crime Vault and smash the like button. It's much appreciated. And keep these stories coming your way. You open on the raw edges. A neighborhood of low-slung houses framed by birch and spruce. The sky a clean, indifferent blue. Kids' bikes on lawns. A church bell on Sundays. Julie was 17, known for laughing loud enough to make other people laugh. For the tucked-away sketches she carried in the back of her school notebook. She had plans for college, for leaving Fairbanks, for seeing the ocean beyond the white winter. She was not a headline in anyone's mind until the day her mother called the police and everything stopped moving the same way. Officers documented the scene methodically. Witnesses were interviewed. A coroner's report concluded that Julie's death was a suicide. For a while, that official ruling closed the case file and, in the eyes of the law, closed a life. But the people closest to Julie couldn't close. They asked the questions investigators said had been asked, and they pressed because the answers their hearts needed were not the dry facts of a report. Maya Collins, Julie's best friend, is where the story pivots. When you hear her tell it, she's careful. You can hear the bruise of time beneath her voice, the way names and small details have shut like doors. The first time she read the text on her phone, she thought it was a bad joke. 3 days after Julie's death, her phone pinged at 3:14 a.m. in the dark. He's not done. Maya saved that message like a relic. It haunted her in ways nothing else could. She replayed the memory of their last laugh in the school auditorium. She replayed fights. And she replayed one argument Julie had had with a boy the month before. Petty, public. And then everyone pretended it hadn't mattered. The message kept her from letting go. When she took that phone to the cops the second time, she felt both vindicated and foolish. Money had already been spent, ribbons tied, press clippings stacked. Reopening a closed file in a small town is like overturning a dinner table. You either reveal the crumbs or make new enemies. Detective Marcus Hale had been on the force long enough to know the difference between a grief-driven theory and one that held up to proof. When Hale reopened the folder 6 years later, he did it because a cold case analyst had found the original evidence bag where the phone had been stored, and because modern forensics could do what the 70s and 80s could not. Read patterns and data nobody had thought worth reading. He pulled the string on the case with an almost surgical patience, combing for anomalies, for the tiny misalignments between testimony and truth. People think time erases the sharp edges, Hale would later tell reporters. Sometimes it just buries them under dust. The first breakthrough came as an odd mixture of the mundane and the miraculous. A young analyst in Anchorage, bored with paperwork and driven by the new hunger of the internet, discovered that an old model cell phone, preserved in evidence, had one last message in a hidden cache. A storage protocol glitch had left a fragment unreadable to the first generation of equipment, but visible to the newer tools. The fragment contained server pings, timestamps, and a routing signature linking a message to a number that had not been in Julie's life, at least not publicly. That number belonged to a contact in a message thread Julie had not been known to share. When police dug into school yearbooks and basement parties, a pattern emerged. A short, private group of boys who bragged about things in a way that was meant to stay inside the room. They called themselves a name the boys all joked about in whispers. A juvenile thing, nothing criminal. But once you read their messages in context, you see the lines darken. The threads had been deleted, but background backups, archived on a local ISP server, were still there, waiting like bones. The group chat, partially restored, revealed harassment plan pranks, and a tone that grew darker the longer the boys felt anonymous. In the years after Julie's death, some members drifted away, moved out of state. Others stayed and married, got jobs at the local sawmill, coached youth hockey. One name, however, remained a constant in Fairbanks. That name, Ethan Marsh. Ethan had been seen in the periphery of town for years. He worked mornings at a hardware store and nights at the bar, kept himself, and participated in town events with the same unremarkable cadence as any small-town resident. There was nothing about him that screamed suspect to the average neighbor. But for Maya, Ethan was the boy who had laughed at Julie after an argument that everyone else had shrugged off. For members of the restored chat, he was the one who had typed the messages that crossed lines. Hale's team leaned on community memory to fill gaps. An eyewitness who had once tried to report a late-night disturbance 6 years earlier had been dismissed then as a teen with a grudge. Now that same eyewitness came forward with more older details, a description of a truck, the sound of someone jogging away, a shoe print in damp mud. It was small, but in a case where paper had smoothed gristle into bone, small things mattered. When Hale obtained a search warrant for Ethan's property, the feel of the neighborhood shifted. The evidence collected that day was not a cinematic trove, a fingerprint here, a fiber there, but a series of contextual matches. Mud on the runner of Ethan's boots that matched the composition of mud near the scene. Traces of a rare pollen found in particular clusters around the place where Julie had been found, and fragments of a jacket fiber consistent with fabric seen in a photo Julie had taken 2 weeks earlier. Forensics do not scream. They whisper. Combined, those whispers formed an argument. Arresting a person in a small town is like ripping out a page from the town's book of manners. People stood in driveways, unsure whether to say hello or turn away. Ethan, taken into custody, did not put up a dramatic fight. He spoke in clipped sentences, eyes hollowed, as if the years of scrutiny had leached something out of him. The charge read like a headline on the paper that had watched men and women grow old there. Murder, first degree. Courtroom scenes in small towns have a different cadence than the sensationalized trials you see on TV. In Fairbanks, the courtroom filled with people you recognized. The high school gym teacher, the woman who ran the library, the mother who cried with you in the PDA. The prosecution painted a picture of a secret that had metastasized into violence, of a group that used banter to blur accountability, and of one man whose presence at the edges of that banter had become action. The defense presented something different, a portrait of a small mistake magnified into monstrous accusation, of a boy trapped by time's cruelty, of circumstantial evidence strung together into a narrative that seemed persuasive until you'd look harder. Ethan's lawyer argued that the forensics were thin, the witness memories unreliable, and the chat messages juvenile hyperbole. The jury had to choose whether the sum of small things equaled a crime beyond reasonable doubt. It would be easy to think the courtroom would be where the truth split. In reality, it was where people finally named what they had already known in whispers and basements, in the quiet of old friendships. Witnesses came forward who had once been silent. One by one, members of the chat faced a decision: to keep protecting a rumor with their silence, or to fold and let the facts breathe. One of them, who had moved out of state and returned only to be subpoenaed, surprised everyone when he asked for a moment alone with the prosecutor. In that corridor behind the courthouse, he broke down. He had been 17 when the boys had gathered that night. He had been joking too loudly to hear what had turned into imminent danger. He confessed that they had tried to humiliate Julie, that their prank had spiraled, and that after she was found dead, some in the group had panicked. "We deleted everything," he said in a voice that sounded younger than his years. "I thought if no one talked, it would all go away." His testimony did something the physical evidence could not. It gave motive and intent context. It offered a map of how boys who called themselves men of the town used shared anonymity to make themselves feel powerful. It explained the origin of the terrifying text sent to Maya 3 days after Julie's death. Not a supernatural warning, but a threat meant to keep her quiet, to make sure someone else didn't take the curiosity too far. Maya testified too. She spoke of Julie's laughter, of the sketchbook with a dog-eared page, of the arrogance of teenagers who believe they are invisible. Her voice did not break when she read the text aloud. She was a careful witness, and what she had to say was measured like a surgeon's hand, precise, painful, and necessary. When she described opening the phone and seeing the message, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The prosecution used that moment to stitch together the timeline that placed Ethan near the scene, in messages, and in the heart of a group that could not stomach that anyone would tell the truth. Ethan's defense tried to tear those threads apart, to paint his presence as circumstantial, his messages as bravado rather than confession. But the jury had seen the server backups, the partial messages, and most damning in the eyes of many, the hallway confession from a man who said he'd watched things get out of hand. That witness testified that Ethan had been the one to go further than ridicule. He had been the one who didn't leave. The trial's climax was not a single dramatic confession. It arrived in the slow, merciless way truth often does in small towns, through the accumulation of small admissions that, when layered, became a mountain. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict that lit the paper that had once printed community events. Guilty. For many, the word offered a hollow closure. For others, a beginning of healing. The prosecution decided to recommend a sentence that matched the gravity of the crimes. The defense insisted on mitigating factors. The judge, older and careful, delivered a sentence that would mean Ethan would spend the decades he had left repaying a debt the town wanted him to feel. But closure in Fairbanks did not come wrapped neatly. The trial reopened old wounds, and new ones formed. Families fractured, friendships dissolved, and the town had to reckon with how easily it had allowed the laughter of youth to swallow consequences. Some asked whether justice had been fully served. Others argued it had been too late. For Maya, the verdict did not bring Julie back. For the family, names carved into memory remained just that, memory. For the men in the chat who confessed, it brought a liberation mixed with the weight of guilt finally named. There were other confessions, softer and more human. One of the boys admitted he'd been too afraid to come forward because of what people would say. Another confessed to deleting messages and later living with the image of Julie's face in the quiet of the night. These admissions did not erase the harm, but they did excavate the truth that had been buried under the town's good-natured assumption that youth would outgrow bad behavior. Documentary footage would splice together these moments. The grainy photographs of high school hallways, the quiet interview with Maya outside a coffee shop, the judge's measured words in the courtroom, Ethan's expression as the verdict was read. Viewers would recognize the texture of a place where everyone knows how everyone else gets their coffee, where loyalty can become a code of silence, and where the internet had not yet arrived to preserve a generation's mistakes. There is a critical cultural edge to this story. In the mid-90s, phones were not smart, and community gossip could remain local without the amplifying echo of social media. That reality both protected and endangered Julie. Protected because a digital trail was thin, endangered because small-town cohesion can translate into collective protectionism. The Alaska 1996 cold case solved is as much about technology catching up to truth as it is about the moral slow burn of conscience. 6 years had changed how the law could interrogate an old crime. It took the patient, sometimes boring work of analog forensics being reunited with digital insight. It took a new generation of analysts who refused to be content with the word suicide when the people closest to Julie saw something else. And it took brave people, not just prosecutors and detectives, but friends and one-time co-conspirators, choosing to be honest even when honesty broke things. Yet the story does not end with the gavel. In the weeks after the trial, small rituals of remembrance persisted. The high school created a memorial scholarship in Julie's name, a bench by the river bore a plaque about laughter and resilience. Maya returned to art school and kept a folded page of Julie's sketches in her bag. She would later say that the only way forward was to invest in memory, to turn tragedy into fuel for something that looked like better choices. And even as the town tried to stitch itself back together, rumors kept folding into the edges. Some people refused to believe a single man could be responsible. Others whispered of accomplices. There were hints of local politics at play, who had access to funds, who had influence over the initial investigation, and why certain leads had been cold. Those questions lingered and, like the landscape, comprised the shape of a place still learning how to listen. If there is one paradox at the heart of this story, it is that truth often arrives in the form of small, stubborn facts. A text message stored in a mechanic's drawer, a pollen grain embedded in a shoe. A witness who finally says what they saw. The big cinematic moment many imagine. A dramatic confession in a floodlit interrogation room is rarer than the slow grail of dogged work. As the documentary would end this episode, it would not tie every loose end. It is tempting to want a clean bow, an answer that silences all debate. But real life accumulates questions. The final scenes would show Maya at Julie's favorite cliff, looking out over the river that runs through Fairbanks. And the narrator would note that while the Alaska 1996 cold case solved brought a measure of legal closure, the emotional ledger remains open for those who loved her. The cliffhanger. As credits roll, the film lingers on a file box labeled with a date months after the trial, containing transcripts of a phone call between an undisclosed local official and a member of the original chat who never testified publicly. The voice on the tape, distorted but identifiable, says softly, "You can't just cut the line now." The tape cuts. Cameras pull back to a courthouse hallway where a figure is seen leaving. Not Ethan, not Maya. And the shot freezes. The implication is clear and cruel. Stories don't end with verdicts. They echo. New questions form across town lines. Who else knew? Who else stayed silent? And who, 6 years later, never left Fairbanks? If you search for the phrase Alaska 1996 cold case solved online, you'll find debates, threads, and podcasts that dissect what detectives found and what they chose not to pursue. You'll find people who argue the community did the best it could, and others who say justice is a slow process that often leaves as many scars as it heals. But beneath the arguments is a human truth. A girl named Julie was loved. She was let down. And in the end, a mixture of technology, persistence, and community courage began to untangle what had been knotted. The case's final irony is that the message, which refused to die, "He's not done," was both a warning and a promise. It warned of the danger that can live within a joke, and it promised that silence would not remain unchallenged forever. In a town that had tried to move on, the past demanded attention, and when attention came, it brought consequences. For viewers, the story offers a mirror. How do we handle the things we know in our communities? When small cruelties bloom into tragedy, do we speak? Do we protect the person who is clearly in the wrong because it is easier to preserve the peace? The trial forced Fairbanks to answer imperfectly. The answer was messy, human, and ultimately necessary. Julie Spencer's tape had been the kind of small, stubborn thing that wouldn't let the town breathe. The distorted voice on it was a thread. Pulling on it would either unravel secrets or tear the fabric of the place into pieces. Detective Marcus Hale listened to the clip 3 times in a row in the dim room behind the district attorney's office, the room filled with coffee cups and legal pads. He'd seen plenty of tapes and heard plenty of lies, but there was something in the cadence of that voice, an intimacy, a cadence that suggested the speaker had sat in living rooms, at kitchen tables, and had the habit of telling people how the town should be kept neat. Hale ran a name check. The voice print matched VoIP logs dated months after the trial, calls routed through private lines, through numbers registered in shell companies, and through one local municipal switchboard. The logs pointed to an office in town that had been the center of power for decades. People in Fairbanks trusted that office the way they trusted the river to run. It was where elections were organized, parades permitted, and where old alliances quietly got honored. They subpoenaed the recordings. They subpoenaed the calendars. They subpoenaed the petty slush funds and the meeting minutes that had always been written in the most forgetful language. The tapes pushed a thread through a seam they had assumed was closed. As Hale moved the pieces, the town felt a tremor, not a seismic collapse, but a series of tremors. Old friendships shifted when the tremors hit. Maya Collins's reaction was quiet but volatile. When Hale told her they had found the voice's prints in municipal lines, she didn't leap for vindication. She folded a photo of Julie she carried and slid it into her coat. There had been so many people who used the town's institutions as shields. She had learned that justice wasn't a clean thing. She wanted truth, yes, but she also feared what truth would do to those who had protected the town for so long. The first public revelation came in a hearing that felt less like a courtroom and more like an excavation. The subpoena named a familiar figure, Mayor Henry Calloway. He'd been mayor for 20 years. He presided over ribbon cuttings, school fundraisers, and the summer lake festivals. He was the kind of man who lived on the local paper's front page, whose face was on flyers, and whose laugh had been caught in a dozen home videos. When Hale's team presented the logs and the mayor's office calendar, Calloway's face did not crack the way it would have on television. He held a flat, civic smile. "I have nothing to hide," he said in public, and his supporters nodded as if that were proof. But the logs were not about what he said in public. They were about who had the habit of shaping what would not be said. The mayor's secretary had been the gatekeeper for years, and the messages routed through the office had the authority of small bureaucratic finality. An email that says "do not pursue," a memo that quietly reroutes money, a phone call at 3 a.m. that ends with a laugh. The municipal board was fracturing by degrees. Some council members demanded transparency. Others demanded decorum. The newspaper published an editorial asking the town to look at itself with the same merciless clarity it used on outsiders. Rumors turned to anger. Anger turned to formal complaints. The first layer of shame was embarrassment. The second layer, when the subpoena illustrated a chain of communications instructing the police to deprioritize certain leads, was betrayal. Ethan's conviction had been the most visible outcome of the trial, But what the tape suggested was that the case had been shaped not only by boys in a chat room, but by adults who decided which stories were worth burying. What Hale's team wanted to know was whether the authority that had sheltered silence had also nudged the evidence aside. In the months that followed, the investigation widened. Forensics re-examined the small items that had once been the case's most minor details. The pattern of scuffs on a stairwell landing, a cigarette, but that had been overlooked, a receipt for towing services on a night when no one remembered any car being towed. Each thing was a nervy thread. There were more confessions, too, not the cinematic kind. People came forward in pieces, in conversations that were half whispered and half screamed. A woman who had been a social worker in 1996 admitted she'd been pressured to close a report. A retired cop confessed that a lead had been misfiled, the word he used like someone removing a splinter rather than admitting a grave omission. Each admission added complexity. But what it also did was create a record of complicity that was harder to dismiss than a single voice on a tape. That winter, the town held its breath when a new, unexpected name surfaced in a trove of documents. A private address in a cabin outside the town, a place many thought of as an antique postcard of wilderness and solitude. The address belonged to a man who had been a quiet benefactor to the high school, who sponsored teams and gave scholarships. He was known for his generosity, a man who had for decades helped keep the lights on at the youth center. People who loved him called him Mr. Aldridge. His donations were wrapped in a humility that made questions about him feel uncharitable. The search warrant executed at the cabin produced nothing overtly dramatic. No bodies, no weapons, no easily sensational items. But in an attic that smelled of old cedar and dust, Hale's team found a locked metal box stuffed between old fishing nets and a stack of National Geographics. The key had been worn, and the box's latch had been rusted, as if it had been seldom opened. Inside were files, notebooks, and photographs. The photographs were the kind that made stomachs flip. They were not graphic. They were ordinary. A teenager smiling at the camera by a riverbank. A cassette tape labeled with a year. A Polaroid of a woman leaving a diner. But beneath the ordinariness lay pattern. The photos were cataloged with names and dates. Some dates matched old news clippings about missing persons. Others mapped to nights when someone had been reported at a party and no one had been charged. There were names in the box that made people breathe faster. Not only those who'd been harassed or threatened, but names of girls who'd moved away. Names of people whose disappearances had been shrugged off as leaving town or running away. Maya held one photo in her hand for an hour. It was of Julie, unposed, hair windblown, laughing at something no camera could capture. On the back in neat, anonymous handwriting was a single word: study. Beside it, a list of dates. Her heart was not ready for these things. The list reached beyond Julie. It stretched across years in a pattern that began to look less like coincidence and more like method. When the town learned of the box, the reaction was volcanic. People who had assumed charity could not have a darker side felt betrayed. Those who had defended Mr. Aldridge, and there were many, were stunned. The man himself denied wrongdoing. He said the photos were part of community records, kept to remember people who'd passed through or been helped. His lawyer said the files were innocuous mementos kept by an elderly man who liked to collect ephemera. But the arrangement of dates and names could not be easily explained away. The files had been kept with a care that suggested pattern, not chance. In the weeks that followed, the investigation pulled threads that looked like a web. A money trail that showed donations routed through shell accounts, registered phone numbers that matched names in the box, and most damningly to some, a set of photographs in which Julie appeared with people who were, in 1996, pillars of the community. Those photographs raised a question people in town found unbearable. How many of the adults who'd presented themselves as protectors had been in private, Participants in a culture of secrecy? Defense attorneys called the search an overreach. They argued that nostalgia had been mistaken for malice. The prosecutor argued that the files showed a map of concealment. In the middle, families muttered about trust and memory. The town's paper printed obituaries and editorials, and every so often a long feature about how small towns keep secrets. The community had to decide whether to rally around their institutions or to finally allow those institutions to be scrutinized. In the falling snow of late January, an unanticipated witness came forward. He was an IT technician who'd worked at the local internet shop in the late 90s. He'd kept backup disks because he was one of those people who couldn't throw things away. He called Hale and asked to meet at a diner. He had that look of someone whose conscience had been disturbed after years of thinking maybe he'd been mistaken. He slid a disk across the table. It contained archived logs, chat backups that had not been in the trial record. They were raw, crude, full of adolescent cruelty and, at times, calculated menace. The files also contained messages from later years, not just the ones the boys had written in the late 90s. There were communications between older men, using nicknames and euphemisms, that referenced young women in ways that implied control. Reading those logs felt like stepping into a space where people spoke without consequence. The irony was bitter, where the internet in the future would be a force for exposure. In this era, it had been used to keep things among the initiated. The technician's disk showed that the web of protectors included people who were not teenagers anymore. Those who were grown up had discovered the bleeding edge of plausible deniability and used it to their advantage. As the investigation deepened, so did the isolation of those implicated. Schools became anxious. The annual carnival saw fewer volunteers. Old men who had once been cheered at baseball games found fewer people willing to shake their hands. The town's social calendar, once a map of comfortable rituals, became a terrain of potential flashpoints. The press began to circle, hungry for the most sensational detail. Hale tried to keep the work quiet, focusing on records and corroboration, not spectacle. Yet the town was changing anyway. Some people left. Others doubled down on defense. Maya found herself navigating a landscape where old friendships were brittle and new alliances were forged out of common shock and sorrow. More confessions came in small increments. A former bartender finally admitted he'd been paid off to remove a jacket found near the river that might have belonged to Julie. Another man admitted he'd signed a notarized affidavit that would have made a small lead disappear. Each time someone named a fact, the town had to reconcile its narrative. That one person's inexplicable loss had become part of a broader pattern of protection and quiet facilitation. A turning point arrived when a young woman who had left Fairbanks years earlier returned to testify. She'd been an intern at the newspaper in 1996 and had kept a draft of an article that had never been published. Her draft included an interview she'd done with a source who spoke about a late-night fight. The source had refused to go on record then. Now, faced with the accumulation of documents in the box and the disk logs, she felt different. She testified that certain names and descriptions in her old notes matched people now under scrutiny. Her voice was steady but small in the courtroom, where the trial for documents and obstruction played out like a second trial. Not everyone wanted the small-town myth stripped away. There were angry letters to the editor from citizens who felt the investigation was a witch hunt. There were quiet, angry dinners among families who felt betrayed. There were also small gestures of repair. The youth center received a surge of donations from people who said they wanted to help the next generation avoid the patterns of the last. Maya, who had tried to shape her life into something steadier, art school, quiet work, found herself pulled back into the center of the storm. She started an informal group for friends who'd been affected, a place where they could speak without press or prosecution. In one of those meetings, someone mentioned a name that shook the room into silence. The local priest, a man who'd counseled families for decades and whose sermons had comforted generations. He had been photographed in a few of the Polaroids, always in the background, always smiling, never the focus, never the accused. When Hale's team interviewed the priest, he denied wrongdoing. He said that every action he'd taken had been pastoral and that kindness does not equate to complicity. And yet, they found notes in his papers, handwritten in a looping script, listing dates and initials that matched the box's catalog. For many, the discovery of his notes was unbearable because it implicated the moral center of the town. For Hale, it was evidence among other evidence. The legal battles moved slowly. Their emotions and appeals and the clumsy, patient work of sifting truth from the fog of time. The townspeople waited in a peculiar limbo, which is to say they waited as only tight-knit communities do, watching the same news, using the same grocery store lines, trading the same wary looks. Life went on, but it was layered now with an awareness that the past was not past. Then a final discovery arrived that stunned both investigators and the town alike. An old storage unit that had been rented under a shell name years before had been found to contain another box similar to the one from Aldridge's attic. Inside was a ledger, a weathered address book, and most shockingly, a set of cassette tapes. Someone had labeled one of the tapes in a hand that looked exactly like the one on the back of Julie's Polaroid. For study. The dates on the label matched nights when the town had had parties and when girls had been found by the river, shaken, frightened, or simply gone. Hale played the tapes in the presence of a prosecutor and 2 family members. What emerged was a soundscape. Laughter, music, then whispers. The tapes were not neat confessions. They were records. As if someone had been making notes in the most intimate, private ways. And then, like a beam through the room, a voice that everyone in the town recognized, because he had been the face of the city's moral compass, spoke. He was careful in his language, but the meaning was clear. The tapes documented a pattern of behavior, and the voice treated it like something to be managed, not punished. When the tapes and the ledger were made public, the town collectively held its breath. The moral architecture people had built their lives on was full of cracks. Some people sought to explain the tapes as misinterpreted evidence of good intentions. Others saw them as proof of a rot that had been allowed to spread. The priest resigned. The mayor took medical leave. Mr. Aldridge denied wrongdoing and said the files had been kept for philanthropic reasons. The town meetings were packed. People argued in voices that rose and fell like waves on the river. Voices that had once been reserved for weddings and school plays. And then the final, chilling twist arrived on a day that the town had designated to remember Julie. An unveiling of a memorial bench by the river. The mayor, pale and trembling, agreed to speak. He read a short statement about grief and accountability. People gathered. Cameras rolled. Maya stood by the river, clutching a folded photograph of Julie. As the mayor finished, a man in the crowd made a small, calm sound, like a cork popping. It was subtle enough that only those nearest noticed. He stepped forward. Hale recognized him from the photograph that had been in the metal box, a face that had been there at the edges, smiling in the background. He had been a coach, a mentor, someone who'd run youth camps and had a reputation for empathy. He was respected. He walked up to the bench. He did not raise his voice. He did not call anyone a liar. He folded a small packet in his hand and laid it upon the bench, as if it were an offering. Cameras moved instinctively. The man's voice was steady. "I kept this," he said, speaking to no one in particular. "I kept it because I was afraid. I kept it because I thought I could protect them by hiding the shame. I kept it because I was part of it." He opened the packet. Inside were letters, confessions that named names, dates, and places. They were not the wild, defensive ramblings of someone who would later try to reframe everything. They were clear and unadorned, admitting to the role of facilitator, to the knowledge of threats, to moments where they had chosen silence over action. The letters were written by people who had once been part of the secret networks, men who had grown older and who, perhaps, wanted to reduce the weight of their decisions. The crowd recoiled. Some began to shout. Others began to cry. The man who'd laid the packet on the bench was taken away by officers, not for a violent act, but for the tidal aftermath his words released. People in Fairbanks had expected the shock to be the arrest of one man or the fall of one institution. What no one had expected was that the people they had trusted, coaches, mentors, donors, and clerics, would be the ones who stepped into the light with their own admissions. It felt like a community being unstitched by its own residents, painstakingly, painfully. The final chilling blow that stunned the town and made national outlets call their reporters was not a new arrest. It was a photo. It was taken the day the packet was opened and spread through the feeds before the sun had fully set. The photo captured the face of a woman sitting in the second row of the gathering, calm, resolute, someone whose name everyone in town knew and respected. She was the head of the local school board, a woman who had once been called the town's mother because of her tireless work with children. The photograph showed her hand. In it, she held a key, an old brass key with a small tag. On the tag, in a handwriting people had seen before, was the same single word that had been on the back of Julie's photograph: study. The image traveled like wildfire. People parsed it, then looked to one another. How many keys had there been? How many boxes? How many photographs labeled with one small, devastating word? The school board head had a moment to explain, to say the key was for a school storage closet, that she'd had no idea of the contents of every box kept by adult volunteers. But documents circulated showing she'd signed receipts for items stored under an account that linked back to names in the ledger. The town's shock turned into a more complicated, colder thing: stunned betrayal. The comfortable scaffolding of trust that sustained generations began to collapse. The people who had once said grace at the same table now avoided one another's gazes. Children wondered aloud why grown-ups had lied. There was one last image, a video clip from someone's phone that captured the bench after everyone had dispersed. The packet lay open, its papers fluttering in the cold wind. A single sheet had been overlooked. As the camera zoomed, the paper's top line became readable, a list of names, of dates, and by each name a single notation, an address. Under the last name, the pen had scrawled an address that stunned every viewer who recognized it, because it was not some remote cabin, but an address inside the town, a house where a family still lived, where people still planted tulips each spring, and where the mother baked pies for school fundraisers. The final line on the sheet read simply, "Not all boxes are gone." The camera cut out. The last sound in the clip was a woman's voice suddenly cracking. We thought it was over. Then the screen went black. In the days that followed, the town moved like a patient walking through a house after an earthquake, checking foundations, listening for new creaks, counting what was missing. There were more arrests, more hearings, and long investigations into who had supervised certain records and who had failed to file certain reports. For every confession that helped explain, another question would appear like a new crack in a wall. Maya kept Julie's photo in her pocket. She went to meetings and to court dates. She tended to the quiet things in Julie's memory: the scholarship, the bench, the sketchbook pages she'd saved. She also joined the long, bureaucratic work of combing through records that had been hidden in plain sight, searching addresses, rattling doors that people preferred to keep closed. At night, Hale would sit at his kitchen table and look at the maps he'd made, the dates, the names, the addresses. Sometimes the map resolved into a pattern, and sometimes it blurred into the shapes of human error and cowardice. But he knew this. Small things had mattered, and small things had opened a wound, so wide the community might take years to close. The final scene of the documentary would not be a neat denouement. It could not be. Instead, it would show the river at dawn, a bench with a name, and a house down the row where a light burned late. The voiceover would say that some boxes had been opened and some had not, that some people had chosen truth and some had chosen silence, and that the town would, from that point onward, live with the knowledge that its past was not entirely ancient, that its present had been built on choices made in the dim hours. The chilling final moment, the image that stunned everyone in the community, would be a slow pan across a wall in a humble living room. On it, hung among family photos and a child's crayon drawing, was a small corkboard. On the corkboard, pinned beneath a faded magnet, was a single yellowed photograph. Julie, laughing. The same one Maya carried. But beside it, identical in size, was another photograph that no one had seen before, a photograph of the bench by the river. On the back of that photograph, someone had written a date far more recent than anyone expected. It was a date that suggested someone had visited the bench late at night and had not told anyone. The camera zoomed in until the handwriting filled the screen. The letters were neat, almost mechanical. They spelled one word: study. The screen cut to black. The silence that followed felt like the town itself holding its breath. Because if one thing was certain, it was this. Some secrets had been cataloged, some keys still existed, and some people who had thought themselves past the reach of consequence had a little box somewhere in town with a spare, yellowed photograph waiting to be found. And in that silence, the documentary ended, not with closure, but with a sharpened question that seared itself into the minds of everyone who watched. Who would be brave enough to open the next box? Julie Spencer's name would sit on the town's tongue for years like a stone held in the mouth, always there, awkward, and impossible to swallow. After the bench unveiling and the bench's packet, life in Fairbanks slowed into a long season of accounting. People did what people always do after a rupture. They tried to reorder the pieces into something that made sense. Some tried to repair, some tried to forget, and some quietly packed up and left. Detective Marcus Hale kept working because the work was the only thing that stopped the past from whispering into his sleep. He moved methodically through subpoenas and interviews, following paper trails and the faintest of human cues. In town diners, mothers paused a beat before mentioning his name. At the grocery store, he would catch older men staring at him, as if he were a weathered lighthouse that had shown them the coastline they'd avoided. He was tired, but he was steady. The kind of person who understood that truth can be a slow, grinding thing and that reopening a wound without tending it afterward would be cruel. Maya Collins, Julie's friend, became something of an anchor not only for Julie's memory, but for the families who needed a place to stand. When she spoke at hearings, she did so with the spare honesty of someone who had learned to live with grief without being defined by it. She organized memorials and listened to parents who couldn't sleep. Some nights, she found herself scanning the riverbank by herself, sketchbook in hand, trying to outline a life that had been interrupted. She told people that remembering wasn't an act of punishment. It was an act of fidelity. Ethan Marsh's conviction remained a bitter point for many. For some, it was the keystone of justice. For others, it felt incomplete. The larger revelations, boxes, keys, tapes, exposed a pattern that made the arc of blame more complicated. People had not just failed Julie. They had, in some cases, used their civic power to smooth the rough edges of harm. That realization rippled through extended families in particular. Families are not single-story things. They are collections of loyalties, costs, and choices spread across generations. In Fairbanks, extended families sat at kitchen tables and sorted what to keep and what to burn. Some fathers refused to talk about the trials because they could not bear to confront the possibility that a neighbor they'd fished with had been part of the silence. Some mothers organized support groups for young women, trying to give their daughters a compass they had themselves been denied. Teenagers found new anxieties, mistrust of adults, an acute awareness of how reputations are assembled and sometimes weaponized. There were generational rifts. Grandparents argued that the town's institutions had always been trustworthy. Their children, with pages of subpoenas and a pile of public records, felt betrayed. And the kids coming up, the ones in high school and early college, felt a responsibility to be different, but also a heaviness about what different actually required. Some families found healing in communal action. A scholarship in Julie's name grew, funded by people who wanted to invest in the future rather than the past. Other families, however, fractured. A man who had been arrested after the bench disclosure lost contact with his sons. A woman who had been a pillar of PDA life faced whispers and quiet exclusion. Those private ruptures layered on top of the public revelations, creating a town that had to relearn how to trust and how to grieve all at once. Economically and culturally, the town had to adjust too. Fundraisers that used to be cozy and familiar became events with checklists for transparency. Boards that had once met over coffee now held their meetings in public rooms with recorders on the table. The mayor's office changed hands, and the new leadership spoke of accountability as if it were not just a policy, but a moral imperative. That rhetoric, while necessary, could feel thin in living rooms where people were still trying to figure out which photographs belonged where and which stories could be told without reopening wounds. For many young people, the episode became a kind of rebirth of civic awareness. Student organizers formed groups that advocated for transparency in school governance. Journalism classes became more investigative. Students learned to handle records requests and to ask uncomfortable questions. The local paper, battered but persistent, trained a generation of young reporters to be both humane and rigorous. In one high school classroom, a senior project titled Keeping a Town Honest examined the chain of custody of records and the ethics of memory. The project did more than earn grades. It seeded a cautious optimism that the next generation might make different choices. Across families, rituals of repair like memorial services and public apologies were awkward but sincere. Some communities in Fairbanks would spend years continuing to quietly make amends. The bench by the river became less a tourist photo and more a place where people left notes, drawings, and the occasional pressed flower. Parents who once had set severe boundaries against their children's late-night parties started conversations about consent, about the consequences of bullying, and about bystander responsibility. These were cultural shifts that couldn't be legislated, but could be taught and modeled. Yet trauma doesn't resolve because new programs start. It lingers in small, stubborn ways. In the way some parents refuse to let their daughters walk to town events alone. In the way a community leader's name still elicited a pause at PDA meetings. The emotional landscape was uneven. Some people found clarity, some did not. For many, the only honest path was to live with the messy, uneven truth that communities are built by flawed humans who sometimes protect their own in ways that harm others. The legal aftermath continued as well. Some cases were reopened because new evidence demanded it. Some people were charged with obstruction, others with lesser offenses. There were acquittals and convictions, confessions and denials. The law could punish some of the crimes. It could not mend a broken childhood or retrieve the time wasted by secrecy. Instead, justice became a process rather than a moment. A long catalog of documents, hearings, and restorative conversations. To close the story without advice would feel irresponsible. So to the younger generation in Fairbanks, and to anyone in a community that resembles this town, I offer what the town is learning, not as doctrine, but as plain truth. First, speak early. If something makes you uneasy, say so in a voice that can be heard. Small interventions matter. A message to a friend, a call to a trusted adult, a note to a teacher. These actions can create traces that, years later, might be the thing that prevents harm from being hidden. Second, document, but humanely. Record dates, keep a journal, save messages. Documentation isn't about weaponizing pain. It's about creating a factual trail so that memory doesn't become argument. If you can't do that safely, tell someone who can hold the record. Third, learn the power of collective responsibility. A single brave voice is vital, but a chorus is often required. Organize, form safe collectives, and support one another. Systems change when people push them to be better. Institutions bend when the community insists they be accountable. Fourth, model consent and empathy in everyday life. Teach younger kids what respect looks like in small acts. How to ask, how to accept and know. How to step in when someone is being demeaned. These small lessons ripple outward in ways that adult speeches never will. Fifth, hold leaders accountable. Not viciously, but diligently. Leaders should be asked to explain, to show records, and to accept scrutiny. Accountability doesn't mean endless vilification. It means that those with power must be transparent. And finally, carry memory with dignity. Remembering is not mere pain. It is responsibility to those who cannot speak. Build memorials that serve life. Scholarships, community centers, workshops on consent and conflict resolution. Let memory be a living thing that teaches rather than a shrieking ghost that destroys. The town's healing will not be neat. It won't be linear. There will be anniversaries that sting. There will be days when the river looks like it always did, and days when the cold wind seems to remind people of the past. But there's hope when institutions are rebalanced, when families talk honestly. When young people decide to act differently, communities can change, not because they are suddenly perfect, but because they are willing to keep working, to keep asking, and to keep holding their leaders and themselves to consistent standards. In the quiet, in the small rituals, Fairbanks began to rebuild. Children learned new songs at school about kindness and courage. Parents traded tips on conversations to have with teenagers. Maya kept making art, and sometimes a teacher would bring her class to the river to talk about community and responsibility. Detective Hale retired after a decade of watching the town shift, but he left a ledger of lessons and a reputation for persistence that would be taught in local academies. And somewhere in town, there would always be a bench with a name on it, an open packet for those who needed to remember, and the knowledge that some boxes had been opened and some had not. That last truth is neither comforting nor despairing. It is simply real. The work of a community is never finished. Each generation must take up the task anew. The aching lesson from this era of reckoning is simple. Silence can be corrosive, and courage is noisy. If the younger generation can be brave enough to break the easy silences, not for the drama of exposure, but for the quiet work of protection, then the town's future will be measured not by the boxes that remain, but by the lives it chooses to guard. In the months that followed, the town stopped waiting for a single moment to make everything feel normal again. Normal never came back the same way. What came instead was something quieter, harder earned, and maybe more honest. The schools held assemblies about speaking up. The police department changed how old evidence was stored. The newspaper printed a full memorial insert with Julie Spencer's photograph on the front, not as a case file, but as a reminder that one life can change the shape of an entire town. Maya stood at the river one last time before winter settled in fully. The wind cut sharp across the water, but she did not hurry away. She placed a sketchbook page inside the memorial box near the bench, a drawing of Julie smiling in the sunlight, the kind of smile that had once filled a room before anyone knew how much silence could cost. She looked out at the town and thought about how many people had carried pieces of this story in secret for too long. Some had carried guilt. Some had carried fear. Some had carried grief, so long it had become part of their posture. Then Hale arrived, hands in his coat pockets, older now, with the tired look of a man who had spent years pulling truth from frozen ground. He did not speak at first. He only stood beside her and watched the river move beneath the ice. At last, he said the case was not just solved. It had changed things. Families had told the truth. Records had been opened. People who once looked away were finally forced to look. It was not clean. It was not fair, but it was real. That was a part the town would live with. Not the drama, not the rumors, not even the arrests. It was the knowledge that silence had been the real enemy all along. Silence had protected lies. Silence had fed cruelty. Silence had allowed a girl like Julie to be remembered first as a tragedy and only later as a person. And yet, by the end, Julie was being remembered the right way. Not as the case that shocked Alaska, not as the story that stunned Fairbanks, but as the girl whose life mattered enough for a town to confront its own shadows. Finally, the last scene should be simple. Snow is falling softly on the bench. The river is moving on. The memorial plaque catches the light. A child walking past with a parent, asking who Julie was, and hearing the full answer instead of the shortened one. Because that is how a town begins to heal. Not by erasing the past, but by telling it truthfully enough that it cannot hide in the dark anymore. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe and share, tap like, and turn on notifications so you'll never miss the next Mystery Solved Cold Case videos. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for watching.